and it asks a very poignant question. Does your macaroni get buried by the cheese sauce? Just consider the depth of that statement for a minute. There are a couple of 100 of us in here, and there are tens of millions of people out there that not only don't know we're here, don't know what we stand for, don't know who we are, don't even know that there is such a position as libertarianism. Are we getting raped by the media? Worse, I think we're getting buried by the cheese sauce. We're being ignored. We have a movement. We've got some ideas. Let's make no mistake about one thing in the beginning. We can never use the media to educate people to libertarianism. I mean, you can't take von Mises and cut it down into several hundred press releases and distribute it through the mass media. We'll just never get disseminated this way. What we can use the mass media for is simply to inform people that there is a libertarian movement, that there are libertarian ideas, there are alternatives to the junk that people are being fed in college courses today. What we use the media for is a teaser. Let's just let them know we exist. And then hopefully we can get a hold of them and educate them and bring them into our media. And there's really only one way to get your message through the media without complete distortion, being sure that it's going to get across. And that is simply, and very consistently with our philosophy, to pay for it. Buy the time, buy the space, and then you determine what the message is going to be, when it's going to be aired or released or printed, how and where it's going to be distributed, who it's going to be released to, who it's going to be released by. Now, of course, we come down to the obvious problem. Can we afford to do this? Well, most movements like our own can't. So there is another way to pay for the media. And that is simply if we can fulfill the needs of the media. They have needs in putting their programming together, in putting their newspapers and magazines together. And if we can fulfill any or all of their needs, they're going to find that they need us, and we'll get the kind of coverage that we've been looking for. For example, the most obvious of all, suburban newspapers, generally on Thursday of each week, run all of those coupon ads, 5 cents off with this coupon in such and such a supermarket, aimed obviously at the housewife audience. But because on this one day a week, there are considerably more advertising pages, there is a need for more news to fill up that paper. So if you know when a particular newspaper is going to run additional advertising pages, and you can meet the deadline with something which they consider fairly suitable for their use, you're going to get the coverage. And if you write a news release, pretty much in the style of the organ which you're trying to get it planted into, the newspaper, the radio station, the television station, or whatnot, chances are very good that the reporter who gets a hold of it, or the rewrite man, being lazy as reporters and rewrite men are, will simply let it go by simply as you wrote it. And this, of course, is the best possible way, because it's not open to his interpretation or the interpretation of his editor or anybody else. It's going to go the way you wrote it. But in order to do this, you've got to know the needs of the media. Another example of a media need. There's a lot of competition now in local television news programs, very fierce competition. The reason being, from the network programming standpoint of view, people who are tuned in to the local news program will stay tuned for the following national news broadcast. If you're watching Channel 7 here in New York, chances are you'll stay tuned to Howard K. Smith, and after that, to their programming throughout the prime time. So they're putting a lot of money, a lot of emphasis into the local news programming. And one of the big things they like to get away from is what they call the head and shoulders news conference. You call a news conference, you've got something to rap about, you read a press release, you stand there in front of a microphone, and you talk, and you talk, and you talk, and that's just what they're not looking for. They're looking for something action to coverage. They're looking for possibly a picket line, although that's kind of old hat. They're looking for guerrilla theater. They're looking for demonstrations. They're looking for photo possibilities. In New York City, there are probably 100, 150 picket lines per day in any part of the city. Sounds like a lot, but there really are if you look at the wire service accounts of what's happening each day. Associated Press and UPI each day in all major cities and on their state wires run something called the Day Book. And it's the list of items which they're going to try to cover during the day, which they're informing their subscribers, the radio and television stations, the newspapers and magazines. These are the things that are happening. And you'll see, picket lines, old hat. You've got to come up with some sort of unusual idea before they're going to cover you in any sort of meaningful way. I'll get back to this subject in a minute. Dr. Rothbard talked about working with allies. Well, here's another area where we get buried by the cheese sauce. When libertarians participate, say, in an anti-war march, that march is generally going to get a lot of coverage, but most people are going to be unaware that there are libertarians involved here. They're going to simply think of this as a left-wing position, a monolithic position. They stereotype naturally the people on the left. They're not going to realize that there are other people involved like us. Suggestion, the next time there is an anti-war demonstration, I've heard a couple of people kick it around, they'd like to get as many libertarians together as possible and march down a separate avenue and join up with the other conference at some point. It may be just tokenism, but it's the idea of trying to point out, not only to people who view the mass media, but the people that are in that main line of march, that there's another point of view here. Don't ignore us. Don't pass us over. We're not going to get buried in your cheese sauce. The area of propaganda is used effectively by the best revolutionary organizations around the world. They study the masters of propaganda. I suppose Joseph Goebbels is the best. That sounds great. Lenin was very good in this area. But I think this is something that we can't afford to overlook. This sounds horrible, studying Lenin and Goebbels. Goebbels said that if you say something often enough and loudly enough, and you are sure enough of yourself, you're going to get people to believe it, no matter what kind of outrageous lie it is. Well, we haven't got any kind of outrageous lies that we want to get across, but we've got positions to get across. And so maybe we should do a little studying of propaganda. This includes, for example, good use of our own speakers. When we're able to get a Rothbard or somebody like this on a radio program or television program, our own people, when possible, should phone in intelligent questions. And there's a classic example of how not to do this. As usual, you might expect, YAF blew it. About a year and a half ago, Philip Abbott Luce was on, I guess it was the Dick Cavett show with Abby Hoffman. And the YAF people were pretty good about packing the audience, and they had their people spread out all over the place. And this was potentially great. And Hoffman, of course, kind of hogged the show, sort of burying Luce in the background. So when it came time for questions from the audience, every single person who asked the question was from YAF. They placed themselves and they were aggressive enough in the question answering area, and they really blew it. Every one of them addressed their questions to Hoffman. They kind of said intelligent stuff, mimicking Buckley, like, Mr. Hoffman, when you're let out of your cage, do you wash your feet? And stuff which simply allowed Abby Hoffman to perform on stage. And by the time this television show was over, I'm sure most of the viewers were unaware that there was any Phil Luce there. Golden opportunity to feed intelligent questions to him, to let him come back on points that have been scored by Abby Hoffman. But the YAF people blew it. So keep this in mind. If we're able to get people from our side onto programs, and they're doing well, or even if they need help, the best way to get our idea across is to feed intelligent questions to them. Let's not blow it like the YAF people did. Talk shows are a perfect medium for getting our ideas across. You'd be surprised how many insomniacs there are in the world who sit up all night listening to these talk shows. And the ratings show that there are an incredible number of people that'll sit and listen to a talk show for 4 hours like Barry Farber, and then when it's repeated on tape for another 4 hours, they'll sit there and still listen. The ratings haven't indicated if these people realize it's a rebroadcast. But here's a way to get our ideas across to them twice. There are talk shows on in every fairly large city in the country, usually several of them, every night. They need several guests every night. They have a need for people. They go out and look for people. So let's not just sit back and let them find us. They might not find us. Any libertarian group, no matter how small, if you're a real individualist and you have your own letterhead and you've formed your own coalition, the usual way to publicize a coalition, if it's just one of you, is to say a new large coalition of fewer than 1,000 members. Send a letter to these talk shows. Make it a fairly intelligent type business letter. If they think you're a clown, some of these shows would love to have you on, but usually you have to have visited outer space. So let them know that you're available. Send lists to all of the talk shows you can find information about. In fact, you don't even have to limit it to your own city. WBR, which is a Buffalo station, has a big 50 kilowatt signal, and that booms all over New York State, Canada, New England. It goes as far south as Virginia, and people, sit around and listen to the talk shows there. And while I was involved with another organization, several times I called them from New York City, prearranged this, and just talked to them on the phone for an hour, hour and a half. So don't limit it to the shows in your own area. And one thing, make sure that you do, if they offer honoraria to people like Abby Hoffman and stuff, demand an equal honoraria. They're paying it, and don't be shy about asking it. The worst they can say is no. But as long as the bread's being paid, we might as well take part here. Another thing that I think we tend to overlook are the wire services, Associated Press and United Press International. The old bugaboo of the radio news media is rip and read. Broadcast journalists, cringe when they hear stations ripping and reading. But the fact is about 90% of all the radio stations in the United States get their news by rip and read. And what this simply means is they go to the tickers, Associated Press, United Press International, in some cases UPI. There are a few others, the Time Life Broadcast Wire, the New York Times, Chicago News Wire, a couple of others. And they simply rip the news off there and read it. So if you haven't gotten coverage with one of the wire services, they may ignore you completely. It's a lot easier to read something which is written specifically in broadcast style for them than it is to take your press handout and try and rework it into their programming. So don't forget Associated Press and UPI in some major cities, Reuters, and if you know that the major newspapers or television stations in your city use any of the other services, for example, the New York Times uses just about every broadcast wire service there is, try and get a hold of this. Not only do they send out news over these tickers, they send out television tape. There's Associated Press video service and United Press International audio, which sends out tapes. So make sure that you send separate announcements of any event that you're holding that you want coverage for to AP Television, UPI Audio. That would mean more than one release to Associated Press in New York City. For example, in preparing the coverage for this conference, we send out releases to the Associated Press local desk, the Associated Press city desk, to UPI, local UPI city, to UPI Audio. It may not work, you may get no coverage at all, but you've got to be sure here. Another thing we're not making use of is educational television. There is now a big ETV network in this country, and on any given night they're reaching as many as 10 million people. Now, presumably there's 10 million semi-literate people who are watching educational television. And again, they're looking for people. They're a little more flexible. than some of the commercial broadcast outlets. For example, on their news programs, they frequently set aside 10 minutes for an interview. So volunteer your services for this, usually in writing. They don't want to be bugged by phone because news operations are usually pretty busy places, so let them know in writing. Another area that's opening up, this is going to be a great opportunity for us to get our ideas across to a lot of people, is CATV, Community Antenna Television, or Cable Antenna TV as it's known for short. This is a system which has been around for 20 years. It simply hasn't gone anyplace because the government has just really kept it down, really over-regulated it. The commercial broadcast outlets have seen to this. They've spent something like $40 million a year lobbying Washington to keep it down, but they're finally getting around, even though people like Mayor Lindsay are making them pay what really amount to king's ransoms in so-called franchise fees for using the city of New York. And this is usually an operation CATV started in some remote areas of the country where people can't get good television reception. So some enterprising individual put up a very large antenna, and for $2 or $3 a month, people could hook up their television by wire to this thing, and they'd get good reception. Well, the idea has spread, and now you've got a place like New York City. It's not a remote area, but you've got problems with all the tall buildings with receptions. So they set up their antenna originally on the Empire State Building. It's now on the World Trade Center, and through cables underground, you can attach your television here. And you get good reception, but the advantage is now they're going to be required by federal law to do their own local origination, their own television programming. So they have additional channels which don't exist on commercial sets. You just have to have the CATV service, and you get, for example, Channel 6 in New York City, which does community programming. They are desperate in looking for people to come on and rap with their moderators or to present their own programs. If you can do it on a regular basis, if you're sure you can show up and get guests every week, you can volunteer to do a program for them. The same would go for non-commercial radio, especially the Pacifica Foundation. WBAI at one point had regular weekly programs by YAF, by SDS, by the Panthers, by Gay Liberation. Most of these were scrapped, not because of lack of interest, but simply because the groups involved just didn't show up some weeks and screwed up the programming. So if you're going to meet their needs, they'll be glad to have you. And cable antenna TV is a good outlet for this too. Another area that it's going to be literally a communications explosion within the next couple of years are video cassettes. These are the new devices you've probably read about. You know, a cassette you can play music off of on a tape recorder, an 8-track, or a cassette itself. They're going to have this. It's on the market now in some areas. It's a test market, I think, in Denver, a couple of other places. They're going to tape political events, sports events, conferences, debates, speeches, operas, things like this, and they'll be on a video cassette which you can plug into an attachment on your television or into a special television and watch this television program whenever you feel like it. And they're looking around now, pretty much all of the major broadcasting operations, the commercial operations, have their own divisions doing this sort of thing. And they're looking for things to cover. And we made a couple phone calls and tried to get them down here. We weren't able to, but they said, let us know next time. They were definitely interested. So here's another area that we might be able to get coverage. I think we ignore the weekly newspapers. Most people laugh at their weekly newspapers. You know, man bites dog stories, except they're usually dog bites man, and they're usually pretty dull, and they're usually advertising sheets. But they've got to be doing something, right? There's almost no daily newspaper in the United States that's making money today. But there are almost no weekly newspapers that are losing money. It's a very good business. It's something which you really could get out and start on your own if you wanted. My partner and I started one in Manhattan. We started with literally no capital at all. It's a going operation. It should be a very profitable operation within the year. We're out every other week right now in the east part of Manhattan from about 4th Street to 40th Street. We'll be weekly by September. The whole thing runs itself by advertising. How much advertising you get determines the number of pages. You're not going to take a loss. You just put out the number of pages you have advertising for, and you set up a percentage how much news you want. But because these are so successful, somebody's got to be reading them, and people do read their local papers. Chances are you can't persuade a weekly paper just to put in a long article about libertarianism or what we're doing, unless you get a local angle. And they'll put that right up at the top of the article. You know, Joe Doe, local boy, throws in with radicals, and then they'll go to your article. And then in all of these things that we use, we're forgetting that we need reprints. When we get a newspaper article about our activities, good, bad, or indifferent, when we get a story in a weekly or a daily or a newspaper, we should save these. And these are great recruiting items. These are great fundraising items to be mailed out to people. These are also nice things to include in press releases that you send out. For example, in the handling of public relations for this conference today, we sent out reprints of the New York Times magazine, which had, I'm sure most of you saw, the red fist here in the background and the two fellows from the Columbia Freedom Conspiracy, which is a great thing. What it's saying to the news media is, hey, the New York Times covered it, therefore we must be legit and we must be worth covering, because everyone knows that what the New York Times says is infallible. Yeah. So basically, let me just go back over this. Couple of areas we've got to remember. We've got to remember propaganda. It's worth studying. We've got to remember that if you want to get a message across, you've got to pay for it. Either you put up the money for the advertising space or the time to control the message, make sure that there is the least possible amount of distortion, or you meet the needs of the media and get your message across with the least possible distortion. You can meet the needs by dramatizing things that you're doing, guerrilla theater, photo possibilities, action type of activities, something they can photograph other than the dull head and shoulders news conference with the guy just standing up there and rapping. Don't forget the areas that we've been forgetting. The talk shows, the wire services, educational television, community antenna television, video cassettes, and the weeklies. And don't forget that when we get publicity, we should save copies of everything. They're great when we're sending out direct mail fund appeals. The reason is to show people, all right, if you're going to send your money in, what are you going to get for it? You show them the reprints, and it shows that we've done something, that somebody's noticed us, and somebody's more willing to cough up money for our activities if they see that they've gotten something out of it in the past, that they will get something out of it in the future. So basically, this is what I think we've got to do to keep from getting buried in the cheese sauce.